In this liberal religious community, we welcome all. Our generations join together to nurture spiritual growth and personal transformation, that we may be inspired to transform the world with love, hope, compassion, and justice. Reverend Tamara Casanova Suzuki is away today, but she will return to the pulpit next Sunday. And this morning, we are delighted to welcome Michael Guinn to Live Oak. Michael is a writer, a public speaker, and a singer. He's partly famous for having the good sense to locate, bedazzle, and marry the Reverend Nika Eden Guinn, the settled minister at Conejo Valley UU Fellowship. He also loves being a father to their 13-and-a-half-year-old son, Gabriel. A Presbyterian preacher's kid, that's the PK, by the way, who grew up in Texas, Michael swore he'd never return to church once he was old enough to say so. Decades later, he's as dumbfounded as anyone to have found a religion that has not tried to save or convert him, but manages to accept him as is. With degrees in film, theater, and international relations, Michael paid the bills in the 80s and the 90s as a recording artist, singer, songwriter, and voiceover person, but eventually left all of that to work in the glamorous, low-stress field of tech support. Just last year, Michael sold that business to spend more time with his writing and his family, two of his favorite passions. He spends far too much time writing political essays on Facebook. Yeah, don't we all? No. And he also writes UU stories for all ages, and we'll hear one today. Hopes to publish those in the future, along with a memoir about his misspent boyhood in Texas. So, welcome, Michael. Community is formed by deepening our connections, to learn of the many ways we build community at Live Oak. Everyone's encouraged to read the Acorn Bulletin. You know the drill, it's sent out weekly, electronically. And in particular, please be sure to check out the posting this week about the event book fundraiser. There are some events posted on the event book fundraiser website that will be taking place on the 4th of November and the 11th, so they're coming right up. And if you have any questions about those events or the event book, see Jerry Mulder or Kristen Oddie.
Oh, good morning. Good morning, good morning. It's so good to be back in one of my favorite congregations on the whole planet. It's particularly fun to be in the pulpit today because I've had the honor of singing with your amazing choir with John Douglas at the head of that 3 or 4 times, but this is the first time I'm in your pulpit and I'm very excited to be here. And as Jim mentioned, or has described at some point or another, I've been lay preaching at many UU congregations in the LA, Ventura, Santa Barbara counties for the past 5 years or so, but this is my first time here in Goleta. And Goleta, the good land, was my first California home way back in 1977 when I moved here from Texas. And it only took me 40 years to get back here, So good morning and a warm welcome to all who have chosen to gather with us today. As our chalice lighting suggested, today's service is based around the theme of sharing the good news of Unitarian Universalism, sharing it with our friends, our neighbors, and anyone else it might seem relevant to mention to. We have something very important and precious to offer. We are an incredibly diverse community that welcomes all people of goodwill. I invite us to take a deep breath, exhale, and open your hearts and minds, and let's have some fun this morning, shall we? Would any kids like to join me for the story? Or you can, I'm okay either way, but don't leave me next to all this food unattended. Gotta, I need some supervision or something over here. Oh, you are awesome. Look at the yoga pillows. Get comfortable. Definitely get comfortable. So this morning's story is a story I wrote about a very smelly mayor.
I know the story.
No, I don't think you do. The picture was taken from somewhere else, but I think this might be new. We'll see. If you know it, then you are definitely psychic. And you could be. As the people in Shepton, in the town of Shepton, were painfully aware, the mayor was a large, smelly, unapproachable bear. Now, they were good folk, the locals, mostly kind and true, and they did their best to live up to their values. But the smelly mayor was a problem that would not go away. They were afraid to confront him because he had a temper that way. As far as the smell would go, and neighboring counties complained, no one had been successful in getting this changed. And nobody quite knew why the mayor hated to bathe. Was there childhood trauma? Was he forced to behave? Could it be an allergy or just his DNA? It was never clear why the bear refused to bathe. Now, you might think this stink a mountain made from a molehill, but Mr. Ollie Jefferson, a mole, was forced to take pills. Sarah and Sally Wolf, now legally married hounds, had to wear nose plugs when the mayor made his rounds. And it wasn't just a general odor, as if that would be enough. The bouquet came from many sources and could knock you on your duff. When he took off his shoes in a city council meeting, Mrs. U had to leave with a migraine that was bleating. Mr. Mayor never washed behind his big ears. When he scratched them in meetings, there were crocodile tears. Now, I dare not dwell long in describing the mayor's breath, but Mr. Marmot would get queasy and begin quoting Macbeth. Now, if the mayor ever noticed his impact, he never let on. The townspeople could drop like flies, but understanding never dawned. For the 4th of July parade, the mayor was surrounded by horses while torches blazed, but Mrs. Badger still fainted when he lifted up his arms to wave, and the horses complained to their union rep, Dave. People tried to adapt and give the mayor wide berth. When they saw him coming, they ran for all they were worth. So as you can imagine, Shepton was not a town of much mirth. No one dared speak up, as his temper would surely flare. Everyone kept their mouths shut, afraid to confront the smelly mayor. They tried hinting with bath salts and rubber duckies at his gate, but the mayor just ignored them and refused to take the bait. Now, there was some hope when the rains came he might be caught outside, but even when this happened, he still had a smelly hide. In spite of the rainy weather, he smelled like moldy leather. Instead of just ripe, he now reeked like wet tripe. What nobody said, but everyone knew, the mayor had become a big bully of PU. One day, Miss Pigeon had it up to here. She raised her voice and was very clear and said, "I'm fed up with living in fear of our very smelly bear. We must do something now, even though we're scared," she declared. "I'm going to tell him what we should if we weren't so afraid of his wrath. You, Mr. Mayor, are in desperate need of a very soapy bath." Well, she was greeted with silence, 7 seconds to be precise. And then suddenly, everyone had all kinds of advice. "Are you sure? Is it safe? Won't it be worse if we tell him to his face? I'm not sure it's terribly wise. We'll all have to live with his angry eyes. Shouldn't we just leave well enough alone? Maybe he'll just change all on his own." But Miss Pigeon and the town had been through a lot. She could see when the people were overwrought, and she could tell her hamlet was more than bad smelling. Something was rotten in Shepton that needed a good telling. So she turned, marched right to the mayor's front door with at least a dozen shocked faces behind her, jaws on the floor. When she later reflected, she was surprised by her actions that day. They seemed to suggest she was not afraid. But she was, and yet she persevered. Courage does not mean we act without fear. Courage is what we do in spite of trepidation. And so Miss Pigeon would remember this confrontation. "Mr. Mayor," she yelled, gathering all her power, "you smell really bad and it's time for a shower. If you refuse to bathe, we will insist that you leave. Your stench is too great, and it's getting hard to breathe." And then there was silence as the townspeople cringed, awaiting the roar of the mayor unhinged. But it never came. It was quieter than a mouse. Then an unfamiliar sound came from inside the mayor's house. People were confused at first. But oh, the loud hubbub, the sound was water filling the mayor's bathtub. A cheer went up for the brave Ms. Pigeon, and the townspeople hoisted her like a new religion. On that special day, they vowed to remember to speak truth, even to smelly offenders. Now, the mayor benefited by not smelling so gross and started dating another bear who could finally get close. But now, with his new and improved perfume, he wasn't so angry, and no one left the room. So, kids, it just goes to show you that everyone wins when brave people voice their opinions.
I knew that story.
You did? If you're not afraid to stand up and speak truth to power, you just might get a smelly bear to take a shower. The End, by Michael Guinn. Brothers and sisters, and all beloved genders, we are gathered here today in the name of Unitarian Universalism, bound by the glory of shared values and loving each other in community, committed to seeing our love manifest in acts of social justice. Praise be to Ralph Waldo, Hosea Ballou, Susan B. Anthony, Louisa May Alcott, Olympia Brown, William Early, or Elric Channing. Can I get a rise on up? Can I get a rise on up? There, but by the grace of the universe, go I. I hope it didn't rattle you too much. I think I saw a couple escape through the back door there, and my apologies. I don't blame them at all. But actually, I'm here today to try and explain why I'm shocked to find myself, a person with no holy abbreviations before or after his name, standing here in a pulpit. But maybe I should start at the beginning. Unitarian Universalism and I were born in the same year, 1961. We both turned 56 this past year, me in April showers, you in May flowers. Now, even though both Unitarianism and Universalism have separate roots that stretch centuries, the newly wedded you and me are still kind of young in comparison to those older 1,000-year religions out there. So as we both get added to the AARP mailing list and look for movie tickets to get cheaper, I thought I'd share with you a little bit about my highly unlikely path to this pulpit. Now, I was born a PK down in the West Texas town of El Paso. Now, honestly, I'm not even sure what it's like to not know what a PK is, but just in case you don't, and I realize Jim kind of gave part of my reveal here, it means preacher's kid. Now, I don't know whether or not we get to choose our families, but as soon as I figured out that my dad was a Presbyterian minister, I wondered if I hadn't severely limited my options. Now, for starters, we moved to the humid swamplands of southeast Texas just prior to second grade, where no one would tell juvenile jokes around me because I was the preacher's kid. I decided to work to undo that reputation. And I was immediately apprised that PKs were invariably one of two types. Either we were really good, and by that, I mean annoyingly, drippingly good, goody two-shoes, last kid you'd ever want to invite to your roller skating birthday party because they would report to the adults even the smallest amount of horseplay and nonsense. The other option was to be really bad. Well, I didn't really want to be either, but I just couldn't stomach being a goody two-shoes, which is a really weird phrase when you think about it, because it seems to suggest that wearing one or no shoes is somehow more naughty. And I've just never understood we never hear the phrase baddie one shoe or barefoot baddies, right? It doesn't make sense at all to me. Anyway, I leaned towards committing forgivable kid crimes, like sneaking candy, talking in class, telling jokes, and trying not to get caught in the act. My grade school teachers learned quickly not to ask me if I had something to share with the class, because invariably I did. And as a side effect of this ill-fated inquiry, I also learned the definition of a rhetorical question. So aside from disrupting class and doing everything not to look like a boring goody two-shoes PK, there were other reasons it took me years, decades to find my birthmate, Unitarian Universalism. Now, the major reason had to be with my early and ongoing experience of church in southeast Texas. Can I be totally honest? My father, Odin rest his soul, was a very handsome but very boring preacher, or at least as much as I could tell from birth to teens. Now, he had his church lady fans that just adored him because he had TV good looks, great sideburns, smoked a pipe, and was a snappy dresser, but none of that mattered to me. Church was excruciating. I mean, how does anyone sit still for that long? If I didn't jiggle my legs and squirm, some part of my body would surely fall asleep and die. Now, I was a singer, so I got to sing hymns, and I joined the choir to spare me some of the boredom, but I just couldn't get away from it. Church just seemed sadistically dull and intentionally torturous. I tried drawing. I tried bringing in comic books and novels. I eventually began to sit way in the back of the congregation. And when my dad was at a larger church, I would sneak out when I knew he couldn't see me. It was Jack Strickland's idea. Jack, another juvenile delinquent collaborator, taught me exactly how to do this without getting caught. It was when the congregation was standing during the first hymn early in the service. And before we knew it, we were outside and his parents' VW Bug listening to Casey Kasem and American Top 40. Oh, it was heaven. It was absolute heaven. The Bug's AM radio worked without an ignition key, so as we kept our eye on the time, we would just sit back and cruise right in as the service was ending. I always grabbed a bulletin and scanned the sermon title in case my dad were to ask what I thought about it. And I'd say something like, "Yeah, Dad, I like the way that the Good Samaritan took care of the beaten guy on the road when all the holy rollers wouldn't touch him. Always a good tale, Dad." You see, my dad wasn't intentionally boring in the pulpit. He considered himself an academic. Now, he also had very strong feelings about the Southern Baptist holy rollers. Aside from the fact that Baptists didn't drink, and that was a deal breaker for my dad and Schlitz beer, he said he'd be damned. Now, that's the only word that Presbyterians were apparently allowed to use. But he said he'd be damned if people thought of him as charismatic or impassioned in the pulpit. Unfortunately, those were the two things that might have kept me from sliding into somnolence. My preacher dad wanted to be seen more as the scholar the calm, reasoned, witty guy who was a brilliant writer and could lecture on the Bible esoterically more like a professor. So these evangelical, charismatic preachers who raised their voice and tried to get the congregation to feel something, well, they were not who he was going to be. Now, hate seems an odd word for a preacher, but he really loathed the Bible bangers, as he called them. So I knew that comparing the Pharisees to the Holy Rollers, code for Southern Baptists, would send him off into a story that would take the focus off my church attendance. Sometimes you got to be strategic with these things. So sometimes my buddy Jack didn't show at church. Not an option for the PK. I faked every possible illness I could, but I still had to be in church every Sunday. This beautiful day when we didn't have school was decimated until the afternoon when we finally got home and I finally got to change out of my itchy, uncomfortable, fancy clothes. It was torture. My best friend Roy, well, he would go fishing on Sunday mornings or kite flying or just stay home and eat Captain Crunch and watch Scooby-Doo or football. Any number of things that were not sucky, but not me. I was stuck in church from 8 a.m. till noon or longer every Sunday, a fourth of my weekend devoured by the Lord. By the time I was 18, I was ready to leave it all behind. I was an adult, an emancipated man in charge of his spiritual destiny. No one could tell me where I had to be on Sunday mornings anymore. Woohoo! In college, I also learned that Sunday mornings were actually a very good time to recover from Saturday night parties. No, you wouldn't catch me in church. No. I was just starting to understand what a true two-day weekend really looked like. But there were other reasons I didn't return to church. Now, for one, I realized that for me, I just wasn't a Christian. And it took a long time for me to get to the point where I wasn't afraid of not being a Christian. Now, no small amount of fear about not making it into heaven made it hard to feel like I was ever really actually a choice. Now, as a kid, I always liked believing in God. I talked to God a lot. But I understood Jesus to kind of be like my holier-than-I older brother. Now, he was a pretty decent older brother, if you didn't mind that he was perfect, and your parents were likely to compare you to him. What would Jesus do? Well, probably the right thing, because he's perfect, and his parent was God. Anyway, comparisons aside, my parents always told us that God and he were the same, so I just figured I shouldn't triangulate. I'm just going to talk right to the big CEO guy and speak directly to him, as it was in that day, whenever necessary. Later, as I got older and I began to hear more of the theology around Christianity in my small Texas town, I just wasn't terribly fond of all the local culture's excessive focus on sin and damnation. To me, Jesus was really a courageous, social justice loving guy. His message was pretty clear. Be kind, be loving, take care of those less fortunate than you, don't judge others, and forgive whenever possible. Pretty simple, right? He took care of the homeless, the hungry, the downtrodden, while telling the hypocritical holy rollers that their intolerance was not okay. What's not to like? Seemed pretty straightforward to me. But no matter how moderate all the churches I attended there were, they would still have these responsive readings and lyrics to hymns that talked about how bad I was, how laden with sin, or how displeased God was with me. Now, I knew there were plenty of good people who believed that and it worked for them, but it just didn't work for me. So around age 19, I began to explore Eastern religions with a fervor I never quite had for Christianity. Karma and reincarnation seemed a little bit more logical to me as a possible explanation underneath the fabric of life. But even after a couple decades of that, I still wasn't sure what I believed. And there wasn't a community that I could join that I really felt comfortable in. I hadn't found the people to have coffee with. I hadn't found the people that seemed to share my theology. And basically, I'd just given up. So it was with great resistance, claw marks visible to this day in the entryway of our hallway, that I agreed to accompany my wife and son to the Unitarian Society of Santa Barbara sometime in 2008. Now, it sure looked like a Christian church of my youth, with the notable exception of no crosses to be found. I was actively predisposed to find fault with it. I was convinced that either it was going to be boring or just not our cup of tea, or worse, that someone would say something about their religious beliefs that would make me feel uncomfortable. Now, another side note as part of this process was, long after leaving Christianity, I seemed to be this magnet for Christians who would tell me that I was going to hell if I didn't return and accept Jesus the way they saw him. I really hated those moments, as they triggered my never fully resolved childhood fear of damnation. I came armored and ready for that to happen at the Unitarian Society of Santa Barbara. And then it didn't. There was wonderful music there, a delightful music director, and the hymns were kind of catchy. The main preacher was not there, and that day it was a lay-led service. I never heard of such a thing. Where was the professional preacher? They just let anybody up there and speak in his absence? What's up with that? And yet, it was a precious service that had us all wanting to return the following Sunday. Now, probably unlike most, if not all of you, I'm a bit loath to admit when I'm wrong. But it was nice. People were warm and welcoming. No one said anything in the services or during the social hour that made me feel uncomfortable or icky. No one suggested I was a sinner or bad, or cornered me to accept a Lord or Savior of any kind. The lay speakers were actually quite good and interesting, and everyone said we should return the following Sunday when the professional preacher was there. And so we did. The Rev was great, and while I was still very suspicious that at any moment someone would try to convert me, it never happened. A few weeks later, we participated in the path to membership, signed the book, and joined. Even more surprising was my wife discovering that not only had UUism become our faith, it would also become her calling. Before too long, she was in seminary at Star King, and the rest is history, or her story. My wife, the Reverend Michael Guinn, is now the settled minister at Conejo Valley Unitarian Universalist Fellowship. So why am I here? What happened to me to have me stepping back into a church again, or a congregation, much less a pulpit, after spending time in purgatory as a PK? Well, I'm more shocked than anyone. I kept waiting for that moment of ick, that moment when the curtains pulled back and you see the wizard, all frail and human, in need of a shower and maybe even frightened. I kept waiting for someone to ask me to believe a certain thing that I didn't believe, to feel a certain way that they felt I should feel, to proselytize or criticize or analyze me in a way that would make me want to escape and run as fast as I could away from here. But it never happened. It never happened because really there was no curtain to pull back. For the most part, this faith is pretty transparent. It's loving and accepting of all people of goodwill. Now, the songs in church we might sing may mention God, but we're speaking to people of many different faiths, including but not limited to Christians. Hey, I finally get to attend church with my beloved scientific pals who are often atheist, humanist, agnostic, or otherwise. I get to worship with Buddhists, Catholics, Protestants, Jews, Muslims, pagans, and so many more, in no particular order. And I do not believe that I have ever heard anything theologically in a UU worship service that made me recoil. On the contrary, I hear about how we work for others. I hear the universalist message of how the suffering of others means we cannot rest. I see people standing on the side of love, fighting for humane immigration policies and laws. I see UU speaking out against bigotry and misogyny. I see my friends who continue to fight for the LGBTQ rights and for Black Lives Matter inside that movement. I see others working tirelessly for clean water, an end to fracking, and to keep climate change an urgent global priority, regardless of white men with comb-overs. You knew I was going to say that. It feels to me like everyone here is too busy trying to make the world a better place to negatively judge others. Now, I'm not saying we're perfect, but I'm very proud of who we strive to be. Very proud. Honestly, if that Jesus chap ever comes back to the world, I think he'd be pleasantly surprised with our faith. I mean, he was awfully big on actions over words, right? And while we're still a big, pretty wordy group, our actions are how people remember us. I'm very proud of our actions. So here's my question for all of you lovely people. If this PK, who ran far, far away from church for 30 years, can walk into a UU service and get hooked, who else might? Who in your life have you looked at and thought, you know, you really sound like a Unitarian Universalist? Who in your family, your circle of friends, your local community, Facebook pals, and more might really fall in love with our faith if you simply invited them to a service? Actually, there is one thing I think we don't do nearly well enough. I have a theory about it, but it has to do with evangelizing our faith. Now, I know that word evangelism may produce an ick in many of you. I get it. It certainly did for me for decades, but hear me out. We live, love, and practice in one of the world's most beautiful faith traditions that almost nobody knows about. How did that happen? Too many times I tell people I'm a Unitarian Universalist, I see that blank, distant look in their eyes. And I immediately explain, hey, we're a church that has incredible theological diversity, with atheists all the way to devout theists. We're bound more by our shared values than one holy text. We're big on social justice as a means of expressing our faith. I talk about our principles informing our actions. I talk about the warming centers here in Santa Barbara and Goleta. I explain how we work to repeal Prop 8 and continue to work to reform horrible immigration policies, private prisons, gun violence, clean water issues, LGBTQ violence, and these are only just a few of the progressive causes that we support and act on. You know, to paraphrase a Christian song I used to sing in my youth, they will know we are UU by our love, by our love. We are an action-oriented people, and our love made manifest calls us into action. These are not just words. So, my challenge here to all of you today is to find one person in your life that you can risk telling about this beautiful congregation. This loving, tolerant, inclusive community. The more people know about us, the more hands we can have on deck to make the world a better place. We need to talk more about what we're up to and not just keep it to ourselves. Now, I used to work in the nonprofit world where the phrase, the ask, is often bandied about. Now, the ask is how, when, where, and how much you can ask people to give. If your nonprofit is, say, Direct Relief, a wonderful organization here in Santa Barbara, in Goleta, you can't expect everyone to just show up at your door and give you money. I mean, some might, but most have to be asked. Or as basketball legend Michael Jordan says, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. So what's the worst people can say? No thanks? But they will remember you asked. And some will say when, how much, What time? And simply tell me more. Now, there's a joke about a devout pastor whose church was facing bankruptcy. The reverend was a theist, so he prayed to God that he might win the lottery and donate all the money to the church and all of their noble causes. He prayed and checked the numbers. He didn't win. The next lottery was to be the next week, so he prayed harder and harder and decided to fast to show how devout he was. The following week, he checked the numbers again, and he hadn't won. The next lottery was another week away, and this time he prayed harder, prayed nonstop, 24/7, stopping only to volunteer at the homeless shelter and serve dinner to the hungry. His faith was strong, and he was sure that God would not let him down this time. But when the next lottery draw happened, he still had not won. Weeping and broken, he calls out to God and says, "Why have you forsaken me? I've done everything I know to do." And the sky lights up, and there's a big booming voice coming out of it that says, "You have to buy a ticket." God ain't going to buy that ticket for you. Yes, God, the universe, or whatever you like to substitute for a higher power, helps those who help themselves. If you want to win the lottery, you have to buy a ticket. We can't expect strangers to flock to our doors and discover the beauty of our faith without asking them, without inviting them. We actually have to sell a ticket and talk to them about our welcoming faith. Now, we challenge ourselves constantly to be a faith on the cutting edge of radical hospitality. We offer the reality of purpose and meaning for every one of our members. We work to create beloved community for all who walk through these doors. We can't welcome the stranger until we invite her, right? Now, I know, UUs are some of the most generous people in the world when it comes to sharing their time and their money, but we need to be more generous in sharing our light. We should not be afraid to share our rich, diverse, light-bringing love and community. Most folks won't come unless you invite them. And when they come, we have to embrace them and welcome. So won't you join me and help shine a light into the darkness? Be a beacon, a lighthouse. Shine a light. Push away the night and grow this beloved community with your invites. This little light of mine, I am gonna let it shine. May it be so, and amen.
Actually, it's more than one word. This morning, I'm actually reading the words of Jim Pearson, who was originally going to speak about this, but he's not able to be here today. He's very eloquent in his words, and I believe every one of them. Our half basket this morning is the Church of the Larger Fellowship. Now, some of you may not even know what that is, and he explains. If you are like me, he says, you often look around this room and feel buoyed by the love and connection with so many familiar faces. But you may be like me in another way as well. I sometimes scan the room and wistfully reflect about how nice it would be to see some more faces of color or people who appear to live at society's edge rather than in the comfortable middle. I know we are truly a welcoming congregation, but few people on life's margins seem to find their way through our doors. For this reason, I'm delighted to be able to tell you about an opportunity for us to connect with the very population our message might sustain, but who rarely find their way to us. This week's half basket giveaway is to the Church of the Larger Fellowship. The Church of the Larger Fellowship is an independent UU congregation of over 3,500 members. So you might well wonder why our small congregation should be giving away half of our collection to such a large church. While some of the members of the Church of the Larger Fellowship may be prosperous people living in rural areas remote from a brick or mortar church, most live on the outskirts of society. Over 800 members are in prison. Our own social justice group has long encouraged us to connect with prisoners by becoming pen pals. The Church of the Larger Fellowship website has an active prison ministry that helps find pen pals for those living in prison and acts as a community resource that creates common space to build connection, share ideas, and provide training. Another large segment of its members are those living in care facilities, unable to leave but hungering for human contact. One of its other important ministries is to those who are in the military. The Church of the Larger Fellowship actually was started in World War II for Unitarians serving in the military. Today it is working especially hard to support those openly serving transgender members of the military. It also provides support to those deployed in dangerous places of the world and those returning from those places who may be suffering from post-traumatic stress. Until 1970, the Church of the Larger Fellowship was regarded as so central to our denomination that it was supported by the UUA, our institutional spine for organizational stability and continuity. However, budget problems for our national organization led them to drop funding and make the Church of a Larger Fellowship an independent congregation. While it may be independent in other ways, it is quite different from most UU congregations. Only the top 300 members of this fellowship are able to pledge $200 annually. Most annual pledges are measured in single dollars rather than hundreds. The Church of the Larger Fellowship's members are those people for whom we want to open our doors. Today's collection will not open our doors any wider, but it will drop our walls and open us entirely to those in the world who need succor and relief from our loving community. Please give generously. Unless you write pledge on your check, half of what you give will serve those who are isolated physically, but find community, acceptance, meaning, and love within the Church of the Larger Fellowship. This thriving church needs our financial support. Thank you.
Comfortable, reach out and grab the hand of your neighbor, your friend. We all come together today in love. And friends, we have a bright, bright light to shine in a darkened world today. Now more than ever, we need to be more comfortable sharing it. We can't remain the best kept secret when we have a life-saving, love-enhancing message. So buy a ticket, sell a ticket, and reach out and share our message. Let it shine. Join me now. Let it shine. Let it shine. Oh, yeah.
And now, as we extinguish the light of our communal chalice, our service truly begins.